Dr. Debbie Garratt has more than 30 years of diverse professional experience across health, adult education and counselling sectors. She's a spokesperson for the Mothers of Sons organisation, integral to this whole function today. And as you're probably all aware, they're the mothers of children, of boys particularly, fighting for fair treatment of men and boys in our courts. It was Debbie's unfortunate experience that her son was falsely accused of sexual assault against a minor, and she's going to talk to you about her personal experiences and those of her son, and she's going to focus on the immediate and lifelong impacts of false allegations such as those that her son had to deal with, both for the accused person and their families. And she'll also share some advice with us to parents about how to protect your sons in dealing with false allegations, handling police, and even dealing with those terrible people, the lawyers involved. So would you please welcome Dr. Debbie Garratt.
I haven't had occasion to be introduced as doctor very often, as you'll discover. Since I did my PhD, I've not done a lot of work as a result of what has occurred in our family. So today I'm going to talk to you about the story of our son Lucas. The words will do very little to convey to you the trauma that his story has caused for all of us. So I want to give you perhaps a little context that may help you understand the depth and intensity of this experience. 18 years ago, we buried Lucas's older brother Bobby 12 days after his 17th birthday and after a 9-month battle with cancer. And I guess if anyone is a parent, you can imagine the depth and intensity of that as an experience. Every emotion we felt during what you're about to hear in Lucas's story was in many ways different, but also equal in intensity that we experienced as we nursed and lost Bobby. The fear, the helplessness, the anger, and the grief. You will hear my story and Lucas's story, but it's much bigger than the words. So Lucas and I have spent some weeks talking and thinking about how to distill what's been a 6-year ordeal for our family into a 30-minute talk. We've also shed many tears right up till last night as we've relived it. I'm not going to cry. If Lucas does, he's not here, but I'll feel it and I might cry. In reality, it's been over now for a little over 2 years, yet the feelings of trauma continue. In August 2018, our then 25-year-old son Lucas was accused of sexually assaulting a child. Lucas had worked in childcare for more than 2 years and was highly regarded by his employers and families, so much so that many of those families sought him out to do private babysitting. This included the family that accused Lucas of assaulting their child. Lucas had provided care for all of this family's children, both in the childcare centre and as a private babysitter over a number of years. According to text messages the mother had sent Lucas over time, the children loved him and were always excited to hear that he was coming. On the night in question, the eldest child, who Lucas had looked after since she'd been in nappies in a childcare centre, had been repeatedly scratching and worrying at her vulva, as many little girls often do. As this had continued when he was putting all the children to bed, he had got a baby wipe and given her a little wipe, threw the wipe away, settled her to sleep, thought nothing more of it. The next morning, the girl allegedly asked her mother, "Why did Lucas lick me?" The reaction to that statement and the reinforcing of it as fact, and that no other possibility was considered, launched the next 6 years of our life. The child was informally interviewed by police that morning, and was asked directly 3 questions specifically. Had Lucas touched her? Had he put his head near her? Had he licked her? And to all 3 questions, she answered no. We didn't see those police notes for many months later. We only saw later interview notes. At that point of 3 no's, the child was sent off for an invasive forensic exam. The mother described the forensic exam in later court as extremely distressing, as one imagines it would be, and one from which we asserted could have confused many things in her mind before she was able to be clear about what had or hadn't occurred 2 nights prior, because it was then the following day before she was officially interviewed. That same afternoon, Lucas was approached by police at work at the childcare centre and asked to come down to the police station for questioning, which he willingly did. First mistake. He was then told there'd been an allegation of a sexual assault. He denied any assault, willingly provided DNA swabs. He told us later he just wanted to ring the parents and explain. He was very confused. The police drove him back to work at the childcare centre and told him that nothing may come of the allegations and to carry on his life as usual. He heard nothing at all for 6 months. During that 6 months, we almost thought it would go away, that the parents had realised it was a mistake and that life would go on. Lucas continued his work in childcare with the full knowledge of the police, his employer, and many of the parents who came to hear about the allegation and who did not believe he could have perpetrated against any child. During the official interview of the girl, which was 48 hours after, another 24 hours after her forensic exam, her replies to questions were muted, vague, very directed. She was not asked the same direct questions she was asked in the informal interview. And the story seemed to have grown substantially since the forensic exam. She talked about being asleep, being awake, having her eyes open, sneaking around, hearing things, not hearing things, and she also said how much she liked Lucas. 6 months passed, and in February 2019, Lucas was formally charged with 6 counts of sexual assault. Once the charges were laid, the media had a field day. His name and face were plastered all over the front pages of the newspapers. Threats of the most abusive kind and vile kind were posted on social media, both toward him and toward us. He was scared to leave the house. The media accessed his Facebook page, maybe these posts were public, and put posts such as the worst kind, a picture of him when he was at a St Vincent de Paul shop and he and his friends were trying on different clothes for a fancy dress party, those kinds of things that went on the front page of the newspaper. We contacted a solicitor we knew who'd been a long-standing family friend, we thought, who recommended that Lucas was eligible for legal aid. I was very preoccupied at the time with nursing my dying father-in-law and running between giving morphine injections and having legal appointments, and my attention was not as fully focused as it needed to be for Lucas. And we agreed that legal aid would be a good solution for him. The barrister we were connected to assured us that Lucas was unlikely to be convicted based on any lack of evidence, including any lack of DNA. So the DNA had come back that there was not Lucas's DNA on the child. There was on her pyjamas and, other places where you would expect people's DNA to be if they've been in contact with someone. So we felt quietly confident, although during that time I became obsessed with the brief. I became obsessed with knowing the case backwards. I became obsessed with saving the life of this child, and I couldn't work. The assurance the barrister gave us changed dramatically 6 months later when we travelled to Melbourne for what we were told was just a routine hearing that simply required his attendance, so my husband and I accompanied him. The hearing was to establish the rules of interview for the alleged victim and was a routine part of the process. At the end of the first day, the judge asked our barrister if there was any chance of getting a guilty plea before the end of the day, so that the girl wouldn't have to endure the questioning the next day. And our barrister said, "Of course, Judge, maybe I'll talk to my client." Well, we were just absolutely stunned. It had never been something that had been discussed or considered. And we were shocked. I was further shocked that as the rest of my family left the room, I sat in the back of the courtroom and I heard our barrister talking to the prosecution team about how he really believed we should Lucas, it felt like a we, should take the guilty plea, and he'd really tried to talk us into it. And they talked about the extreme sentence they were going to try and get for him. Lucas was then told, and we were told by our own barrister, that he was unlikely to be acquitted after 6 months more of telling us this was not going to even probably get to trial. That juries rarely acquit in these cases. That the current political climate wasn't very good for him. And that given that the judge had suggested a plea, it doesn't look good. He was told he could spend upwards of 15 years in prison if found guilty, then life as a registered sex offender, but that this could be reduced to a few years and he could be out by the time he was 30 if he took a plea. This pressure included the fact that he had to decide within the hour and that a guilty plea would save the child from the trauma of testifying. We all sat in a public area outside the courtroom with the barrister telling us time was running out. Lucas rang friends, he paced, he cried. I kept trying to get more information. What is in there that we don't know about that's made this change? We were frantic and quite frankly out of our minds that we let this next step happen. I remember saying to the barrister, "What about the truth?" And the barrister almost yelled at me, saying the truth was for religion, not courts. The barrister told us that if Lucas pled guilty, he would be able to come home with us until sentencing, and that felt like a little bit of breathing space to me for some reason, but it turned out not to be true. Pleading guilty was also going to come with an added burden for Lucas in knowing how many people had believed in him, his employer, families of children he'd been caring for, his friends, family, who would now believe him capable of such a thing. That hour was like we'd been thrust into a different reality. I remember being so shocked and so scared at the turn of events. And Lucas made the decision based on real fear and potentially the loss of his life until he was well into his 40s to plead guilty. He was then immediately taken into custody. We had no idea where he was for several days. It was 10 days before we could see him in a 10-hour round trip by car, the first of many. That first night we went home without him, I knew he and we had made a terrible mistake, and I couldn't work out how we had let it happen. I began researching lawyers. On our first visit to him in prison, he talked about the barrister telling him that he would have to get a good report from a psychologist in order to get the reduced sentence the barrister had promised. As part of that report, Lucas was told he would have to both admit and explain his guilt and explain why he had committed the assault. Now, Lucas knows I have worked with offenders before, I've worked with victims before in my practice, and he said to me, "Mum, why does someone do this? What am I going to say? Because if I can't think of a why, they're going to not give me a good report." I couldn't help him make up a lie about why he did something, and I didn't do it, and I couldn't do that. I told him we would fix this, we would get better legal advice, and we would get him home. I had no idea if such a thing was even possible. After finding and engaging what turned out to be a committed and caring legal team who really believed in Lucas, it took 7 months of him being in prison to get a hearing to have his plea reversed, something we were told happens in less than 10% of cases. At our first 3-hour meeting with the new lawyer, he knew everything about the case from the brief I'd sent him, whereas I'd always been hand-feeding the previous barrister, and it was like he had never read the brief. While the judge at the plea reversal hearing did not directly say that anyone had acted unprofessionally or unethically, he did agree that Lucas's decision to plead guilty that day was not made freely and allowed the plea reversal. The judge was also horrified at the media that had been out there and asked our solicitors why there hadn't been a media suppression order. Our previous barrister said they couldn't apply for one, it wouldn't happen. This judge ordered a media suppression order. However, it was already too late to avoid the very damning and destructive media already there. After that, we had 2 years of waiting for a trial, 2 years of last-minute cancellations, of attempts by the family to have the trial moved to another town, COVID issues, because of course this brought us into the COVID era where some of my obsessiveness turned to speaking out against mandates, and which got me into a whole host of different trouble then. But it was 2 years during which Lucas couldn't make any meaningful progress in his life, and 2 years of living really in fear. I used to take him to the supermarket with me because I was also quite scared. I'm quite fearful, which is why you have to have courage. I would take him to the supermarket with me and I would hold his hand, and he's like this tall. I'd say, "Don't look at anyone, Lucas. They have probably never even seen the newspaper. If you see someone look at you, it doesn't mean they know. Hold your head up. Everything's okay. We're going to do all this together." I would get home and I'd say, "See, it was all good." And then I'd be in a fetal position on the bedroom floor, crying. The effort to get him through it. During the 4-day trial, it was revealed that there had been no DNA evidence implicating Lucas, which would not, in the judge's decision, have been possible if this thing had occurred. There was also no physical evidence of any kind on the child. And the parents, it turned out, had not been told that the child had denied anything had happened to her in her first interview. And in fact, that first lot of police notes did not even form part of the package given to whoever was tasked with deciding whether to press charges. They did not have those first police notes, and we hadn't seen them. Lucas was found not guilty. In her decision, the judge said that she did not accept that there was any sexual touching, and that this was the misinterpretation by a sleepy child of a hygienic procedure, a single wipe with a baby wipe, carried out in good faith. The child's misinterpretations were further reinforced by the actions and reactions of those around her. For me, the fact that one of those reactions was to subject her to an invasive, intimate exam after she denied anything had happened was abusive. The facts, while shocking, are very cut and dried. They're anything but. This was life-changing for all of us. Taking the guilty plea was both a terrible mistake and the greatest blessing. It was a mistake for the trauma of his 7 months in prison. 7 months in prison changes someone. It changed us. It changed my husband, for whom I greatly feared, as he had already lost one son. It was a blessing for our realisation in retrospect that he may well have been convicted. He likely would have been convicted of this crime if we had kept that barrister to represent him. The whole process cost us in excess of $120,000, money that can never be recouped, and this was cheap compared to what I have heard others have had to pay. Lucas and my husband had to attend the trial without me because I was unvaccinated and not allowed in the courtroom. This was a huge burden for all of us. Of the few friends I had at the time of the charges, some never spoke to me again after I told them in my effort to seek support. The few that remained were lost as we awaited trial, and I spoke publicly against lockdowns and mandated COVID vaccines. Since the trial, Lucas has had to leave 2 jobs, as someone would invariably know about or find out about him and talk would start, and in one case there were veiled threats. The best advice we had from people around us was that he should leave town, away from all of his supports. It's now 2.5 years since it was supposed to be all over, yet only last year the mother who had accused him accosted and abused me in the street. I was with another son and my young granddaughter while she screamed and swore at me for daring to mount a defence for my son, swearing at me for getting him lawyers. She told me she had been watching me. She knew my granddaughter's name and the fact that my eldest son was raising her as a single dad. She knew that my granddaughter visits her mother on occasion and to what town. She wondered how I would feel if my granddaughter was assaulted on one of those visits. I still cannot fathom how any mother, even more so a mother who believes her child may have been assaulted, could suggest or wish for such a thing. It's important to understand that the impact of allegations against a man and of this kind are not limited to the time of occurrence or just to the man accused. They do not occur in a vacuum. The trauma of this event on top of everything else we were experiencing and COVID, and I nursed my father-in-law and recently my father, both of whom died at home. This all called a complete halt to my career at a time when I had just finished my PhD, published my first book and had a thriving practice. Lucas spent what should have been the years where he found a partner and set himself up for life living in fear. There are children in our family who consider Lucas their most favourite uncle and they all adore him, and who will need to have this explained to them at some point, given how much still exists on the internet. If Lucas wants to travel, he will be asked about charges in his past, not just convictions, and he will have to explain those to visit some countries. He will have to explain to future partners what happened and hope that they will believe and trust him. Allegations also impact the families of the accusers, who may come to believe things that aren't true. We never forget that there is a child who is growing up believing she was sexually assaulted because she's been told it often enough. It's now her truth, and that will be impacting her. As to the mistakes, the first mistake, sadly, that Lucas made was to enter a field where he was so at risk, in childcare. He understood the risk. We'd talked about it. I'd worked in men's advocacy. In his naivety, he truly believed if he did nothing wrong, he could never have a problem. The second mistake was to talk to police without a lawyer. Again, we raised kids with the, mantra, I guess, the person in the uniform is the good guy. And it was pre-COVID. I didn't actually really get how corrupt the world was at that time. He didn't think twice about going with the police or talking to them. Didn't think twice about giving a DNA sample. Third, and I took responsibility for so many of these mistakes because I took responsibility for trying to fix it all. But I sought advice from a lawyer hotline that is lawyer-based, but I was advised at the time he was I took that advice when the allegation happened. They told me that until he was charged, there was nothing a lawyer would be able to do. We should have sought out competent legal representation then, not waited. And this may not be fair to some very good legal people, but I would argue that if you aren't paying for a service, they have no investment in your outcome. I wish we had sought the best legal people from the start. They were worth every single penny that we paid them. I want to thank everyone here today raising awareness of these issues. I have other sons, I have a husband, I had a dad, I've got grandsons, and there will be other family members. And I hope that all those women and all the Twitter watchers, ex-watchers today that I already saw this morning, will not forget that nobody is immune to this happening to them. In the current climate, every man is potentially at risk. Speaking out is really hard, but we have to keep doing it. Thank you.